What's up guys, I hope you had a good weekend. I actually really enjoyed the race. Up until probably the last 15 laps, I was really thoroughly enjoying the Mexican Grand Prix. I thought I had a little bit of everything. The strategy involved was just brilliant. It was really intriguing all the way through the race. We couldn't call it which way it was going to swing. It was dependent on how the tyres lasted. Was there going to be a late safety car? People were relying on that, or gambling on that at least. And then, in the end, it kind of fizzled out, didn't it? It was just became stalemate, where nobody could get close enough, nobody could launch an attack. And as it turned out, of course, Lewis and Mercedes, they did gamble on their strategy, but they got the gamble right. And do you know what? It was one of those races where I was looking at the thing come the end of the race, shouting at Ferrari, going, do you know what? You've thrown another race away here. And the reason that Ferrari threw it away, and I don't want to be too critical on them because it's much harder to gamble on strategy when you're leading the race, as they were in a couple of occasions. In fact, with both drivers on a couple of occasions, weren't they, Ferrari? It's much harder in that instance to roll the dice when it comes to strategy and gamble. They've kind of got to play it a bit safer at that point, but they pitted both of their drivers out of the lead of the race and effectively gave up track position to Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton, assuming that Lewis's tyres were going to drop away, and then they didn't. And what I was likening that to was sometimes you have to, not forget what your simulation tools and what the laptop is telling you, but you have to mix all of that information you're getting with a little bit of common sense and kind of look out the window. You know, we used to equate it to when we were mucking about with weather radars and sending these trucks that we had our own bespoke weather radar trucks that we'd send up into the hills somewhere around the race circuit. It would be constantly sending back live information just to us. It was our own feed of live weather stuff. And I remember sometimes thinking, you know, these guys are relying so heavily on the information and the technology that we've created to do this. Sometimes it was just better to stick your head out from underneath the Pratt's perch, or the timing stand on the pit wall, called the Pratt's perch because often we used to think the engineers were a right bunch of Pratts during some races. But sometimes it was better to just stick your head out from underneath it and see if it was raining. And if your hand was getting wet when you put your hand out in the air, then it's raining, so let's get on some wets. So sometimes you have to kind of look at the information around you, not just what the simulation says or what the predictive tools say, and that's what Mercedes did. You know, everything was pointing towards a two-stop race being the way to go, but then with temperatures the way they were, with the hard tyre performing differently to the way that most people predicted it would, Daniel Ricciardo, starting the race on the hard tyre, managed to run incredibly long into the race with really strong pace. Then Max Verstappen pitted really early on as well after his puncture, also went onto the hard tyre. More information coming in to everybody watching that he still had performance on that hard tyre way after the Pirelli predictions said you might start to see drop off. And that's what Mercedes looked at. They saw that information and thought, okay, it's working on those cars. Everything's pointing towards that drop off not coming, or at least coming a lot later than it might have otherwise. We might have otherwise thought it should have done. Therefore, we think we can make the one-stop race work. And if we've got track position, let's go for it. And that's exactly what they did. And Ferrari seemingly just couldn't match that. They couldn't think on their feet quick enough, or for whatever reason, they couldn't make the right decision at the right time. And Mercedes outsmarted them. You know, they outsmarted them. Two red cars on the front row of the grid, and yet they didn't finish that way around, did they? So it was an interesting race, as I say, up until the end where it got stalemate and everyone was stuck behind each other because they couldn't close up because of the overheating. And anyway, loads of questions as always. I've rambled on massively in the intro here, but welcome to another Ask Elvis. Okay, let's start with this one from Chuck Bartowski, who says, so frustrating being a Ferrari fan as myself right now. What did you guys do after a bad race? What did you focus on? The mistakes or straight on to the next race? Well, you have to learn from the mistakes wherever possible and then move very quickly on to looking forward. And I might have said this before, I've definitely mentioned it in my book. Ron Dennis used to say to us, and we laughed at him at the time, but he used to say, you know, I allow myself on the Monday morning after a bad Grand Prix, I allow myself the time between swinging my feet out of the bed and then touching my slippers on the floor next to the bed to dwell on what happened yesterday and once my feet are in the slippers, we move forward and we look on till to the following, or the upcoming race. And you know, we used to laugh at him because it was it sounded like a crazy thing to say. When you look at it, actually, it makes a lot of sense. And you know, we have a debrief on a Sunday night after the race where everybody questions all the decisions that were made. We look at the data, we look at what we might have done, now knowing what we know with hindsight. So we make learnings from all of that. We adjust the sort of predictive models based on the inputs that we've had from that race, and as engineers and the team, we start to factor in the things that we perhaps didn't factor in but we now know. So you learn all of that, you take it on board, and then you start looking ahead, because if you spend too long dwelling on what's happened, you'll be depressed, the team will start to lower its mood, you just will not perform at your highest. So it's about looking for the next opportunity, and the next race is the next big opportunity. Right, in FP3, and this one comes from Eli Ocola. In FP3 in Mexico, Lewis had the word marker appear on his wheel through one of the corners. What does this mean, and what does this do? Okay, I didn't actually notice it, I didn't see that in FP3, but what happens is there's a little button on everybody's steering wheel. Sometimes it's called marker, sometimes it can be called other things, sometimes it's data. But anyway, what it does is when you have, particularly in practice, when the driver's going around a circuit and he notices something, perhaps like he's got a little bit of too much differential locking, for example, going through the middle part of a certain corner, he can press that marker button and it puts a marker in the data trace, just so that at the end of the session, when he's sitting down with his engineers looking through the data, there'll be a marker on there, and the engineers will go, oh, what was the marker for? And he'll go, oh yeah, I remember, turn 14, mid corner, or just after corner entry, a little bit too much diff locking or whatever. So that's what it's for. It's for the driver to make a little marker in the data. Sometimes he might say on the radio to the engineer why he's done it. Other times it might just be in his own mind as a reminder, or something for the engineers to bring up in conversation later, so that he can bring up that specific moment and talk about what he needs or what problems the car might have. Maybe it's a good point, maybe it's something really positive about the car at that moment, but it's just something to trigger in his memory when it gets to the debrief later on at the end of the session. Right, let's go with, let's look at qualifying then, because first of all, let's look at this one. Rapide says, hi Mark, Bottas's crash yesterday got me thinking. Do F1 drivers make any amends for their mechanics as a way to say sorry for the extra work after wrecking a car? Something like ordering pizza for the crew or a few beers. Well, some do. I mean, look, the team don't need that, of course, because that's their job. They're doing it because they want to win as much as anybody else. So they don't need that as motivation, but it definitely is nice to know that your driver is appreciating what you're doing, and sometimes it can be just coming round and having a chat and saying thank you, and just spending a moment with each of the boys and the girls around the garage just to say sorry or to say thank you for the efforts. Other times they might take you out for a meal or do all sorts of things. You know, Kimmy, as many of you will know if you have read my book, he used to take us away at the end of a season, just our crew. He'd take us away on a basically it was a massive piss up because it was Kimmy, but it was a trip to somewhere like Finland or Lapland or wherever, which was amazing, incredible experience, but also really, really appreciated by those guys. So some drivers do things differently, some I'm sure don't do anything, but they're the ones who perhaps don't necessarily get the best out of their crews. So it does make a difference, and of course, you know, we want to know that the driver's doing everything they can for us as a team, and of course when we know that, we'll do exactly the same for them, and we want them to know that we're giving everything for them as well. So that's how you build a high-performing team. It's by having mutual respect, trust with each other, knowing that everybody is doing every single thing that they can to make this the best it can be. Right, also on the subject of qualifying, Alessandro Rosa says, watching the onboard of Max's final qualifying lap, the marshalling lights were dark and there were no marshals waving flags before the Peraltada. Considering it's completely blind, why wouldn't yellows be waved at marshal posts leading up to the turn as well? So Max came round relatively soon after the accident, didn't he? And there were yellow flags, so we're not using this, and I'm sure you're not saying that there were no yellow flags, so should Max be let off? He did see the yellow flags, we know that because he's even admitted it. But should yellow flags have been a bit earlier around the corner? I mean, possibly, yeah, possibly. But what happened was during the accident, and this explains why there were no marshalling lights on his dash. Some of you may know this already because it was explained on the TV on Sunday. But Bottas going into the barrier actually destroyed the marshalling light system for that particular mini sector. So when he went in, he destroyed the marshalling lights, but also the little transmitter box that sends that signal out to the cars, which is why normally the drivers on their dashboard will immediately get the yellow lights flash up on their dash, as well as the illuminated light panel by the side of the circuit. That wasn't operating because it was destroyed in the accident. However, there were still marshals waving yellow flags. Whether they were early enough is another question, but that was the reason that there were question marks, if you like, that all systems weren't necessarily working. But the fact that Max said, you know, I did see the yellows but didn't slow down was enough evidence to suggest that the yellow flags were doing their job. And on that subject, Chip Hines says, what did you think of the Verstappen penalty? Too much or too little? Do you know what? I thought it was fair, and if it had been even harsher than that, I'd have probably still thought it was fair. Lots of people messaged me saying that was a bit harsh, surely just should have had his lap deleted. There were two issues. First of all, he didn't slow down on the yellows, which is a serious offence and has to be taken as a very serious offence. You know, we know all too well about the dangers of what can happen when drivers don't slow down enough for the conditions when there's been an accident. It's not only that there's a stricken car by the side of the circuit, but there could be marshals onto the track trying to deal with that. There could be medical staff. There could be cranes or you know, recovery vehicles trying to get to that. There could be a driver out of his car. There could be all sorts of things. There could have been another vehicle further round the corner other than Bottas's car, for all Max's knew when he came around that corner. So you've just got to lift. You've got to abort your lap and lift. And that's what it should be. He didn't do that, but on top of that, he was a bit flippant about it in the press conference, wasn't he? He was a bit flippant about the fact that he didn't lift, and it was almost arrogant. And look, I'm a biggest Max Verstappen fan, so don't hate on me for going hard on Max here, because I want to see Max on pole. I want to see him winning world championships. But the way he spoke about that in the press conference just did himself no favours. And so actually the penalty I thought was fair, and even could have been harsher, because they have to make an example of something like that to make sure that nobody else does it. Because if you just delete that lap time and he still keeps pole position from the earlier lap, well, it's not much of a penalty, and it allows a precedent to be set for other drivers in the future, particularly young drivers coming through. So I think they did a good job, the stewards, and I think, as I say, harsher would have still been fair. Right, let's move on to the race then. And Frank Villoria says, once again, Ferrari looked dominant in practice and quali, but during the race, Vettel was unable to get within a second of Lewis on newer hard tyres down the straight, or the stretch. How do you explain this? Well, a couple of things. First of all, Ferrari have a really dominant car in qualifying. They don't necessarily have that in the race. Now, remember back when everyone was talking about Mercedes party mode, where they cranked it up for the final parts of qualifying and gave them this massive power boost. Well, Ferrari now have that. They have something similar. They have a really, in fact, a more superior party mode, if that's what you want to call it, where they can crank everything up. And there are question marks now about whether that is related to questionable means, like blowing oil into the charge air for the turbo. I mean, these are all speculations at the moment, but there's a lot of questions, and we may well get a protest coming on the Ferrari car. It will only happen when it suits the person who's going to protest. So, if Ferrari get a great result, and by having them potentially thrown out of that race, it will benefit somebody else, that's when we might see a protest. Because Ferrari didn't win the race this weekend, I guess nobody thought to put a protest in, or maybe no one's got enough evidence to do it. Maybe it's just hearsay. We just don't know at this stage. But the point I'm trying to make is that all of that performance, or the majority of that performance advantage, comes in qualifying. In the race, as it does with Mercedes as well, tends to equalise the cars a little bit. However, though, in the race, of course, what happens is you get stuck behind other cars, and the way that cars are unable to follow cars aerodynamically at the moment is one problem, but in Mexico in particular, following a car in front really hurts your cooling ability. I explained all of that in the preview video about why it affects your cooling ability, so go check that out if you haven't seen it. But this is a big problem, and it's always why we got that stalemate at the end of the Grand Prix, wasn't it? Because nobody could get close enough, because things like brakes, power units, tyres would all start overheating if you tried to close up to the car in front, and therefore we were stuck where we were. The lead cars could manage the pace, knowing that no one else could really push up behind and go for a full-on attack. So once you're not leading, then you are massively compromised by pace. And that's my phone ringing. Let's pause it there. So it's not that we haven't got Ferrari being quick in a race, it's just they found themselves, all through their own doing of course, by giving up track position with that questionable strategy, but by putting themselves back behind Lewis in the race, they were compromised in terms of what pace they were able to show. So I think that you know, we can still see Ferrari having a quick race car. It's much closer to Mercedes in race pace, but if they were leading the race, they could have easily controlled it themselves and dominated. So we need to see a race where everything plays out and Ferrari get it right to be able to show what Ferrari can do on a Sunday. Okay, another one on the subject of Ferrari. Patrick says, about the Ferrari engine, why aren't the customer teams not that much faster compared to their relative rivals? Is it something in the engine? I would expect Alfa and Haas to be more competitive on the straights. Okay, well look, that's a good question, and a couple of people have mentioned this. Lots of people have asked, you know, aren't they duty bound to give the same hardware to their customers and the same software? Yes, they are. So the customer teams have to have the same power unit and the software that controls it as the Ferrari manufacturer team. However, first of all, straight line speed comes as a result of power unit performance, but also of course aero effectiveness, drag reduction, those kind of things. So the aero levels of a car will massively impact its top speed. But also on the subject of power unit, although they have the same kit and the same software, the way that it's operated in theory can be different. Now again, massive speculation, but let's just say there's something very clever going on with Ferrari in regards to, let's say, blowing some oil mist into the charge inlet through the intercooler, like I talked about in the previous video. Again, if you missed that, check out last week's video about Ferrari. But let's just say they were doing that. So at a moment when they needed extra power, or in qualifying, they could enable this, you know, this additive to come in via some oil mist into the combustion chamber. Well, that's nothing to do necessarily with the hardware or the software. That would be about how the thing's operated. So if you had a leak, let's say, a leak of oil mist into the intercooler charge air, and then were able to, let's say, adjust your ignition timing to be able to suit that, to be able to suit the different combustion charge that's in the combustion chamber, well then you could run the power unit differently for a short period of time, for example. That wouldn't change the hardware, it wouldn't change the software, but it would change the way you operate it. And that's something that perhaps could be done differently to your customer teams. And I'm massively guessing and speculating, and it may be that none of this is happening, but there are ways that a manufacturer team can operate their power unit differently to the customer teams, even though the kit they supply is the same. The little ghost afraid of the dark says, could you explain why more often than not this year the two-stop doesn't give enough pace advantage to offset the extra 20 odd seconds compared to the one-stop? Right, so what we always get before a race is every team running a series of simulations. Pirelli do it as well, and lots of media do their own versions as well, where they look at the lap times from Friday, they look at tyre performance, tyre drop-off, they factor in things like the pit lane length, the pit lane speed limit, the amount of time lost in a race for a pit stop. All of these different things are factored in, and then they decide, or they come up with a theoretical quickest way around the race. So, for example, the theoretical quickest way to run yesterday's race was a two-stop race. So you didn't have to manage your pace too much on a set of tyres. You'd make 2 stops and be able to push much harder towards the end, or to the end. Now that relies on a sort of perfect set of perfect environment. If you were running on your own, the quickest way from lights to flag after the prescribed number of laps would be to do that 2-stop race, but it's not a perfect scenario, and you have things like traffic to negotiate, and that's exactly why teams will always favour a 1-stop where they can at most circuits, because you don't have to negotiate traffic. We've seen how difficult overtaking can be, and particularly, as I touched on a moment ago, in Mexico, where being stuck in traffic really quickly starts to overheat parts of your car, which means the only way to stop that is really to back off and go slower. And that means you're going slower, that extends your race time. So if you can maintain track position, just like Lewis did, and get out in front, you've got clear air, you've got minimal traffic, you can control your pace, and therefore the 1-stop becomes the preferred option. There's always a risk around making a pit stop, first of all. There's always a risk when you make a pit stop that you can come out in traffic. Even with your best simulations, a slight delay on pit stop, or a slight anomaly in the in or out lap from a driver's perspective can put you behind a car like Albon found yesterday, which can cost you 4, 5, 6 seconds because you're stuck behind a car you weren't intending to be behind, and then your race is ruined. If you're only making 1 stop, you cut that risk in half. Now, we touched on pit stops, didn't we? And there were a number of issues yesterday. As Abby says, some problems in the pits today. How does that affect the crew? It can really affect the crew. I mean, I've seen people really affected, mentally. It can be hard, because you are not only you don't only feel like you're letting down the 20 guys around that pit stop crew and your driver, but you feel like the rest of your team, the hundreds of people back at base, and then beyond that, the millions of fans around the world. When I was at McLaren, you absolutely feel the weight of pressure of millions of McLaren fans all desperately wanting your car to do well. And if there's an incident in the pit stop, the weight of that pressure for some people can be too much. So I've definitely seen that happen. Teams, I suspect most teams now are pretty good at helping people through that from a kind of counselling. If they want counselling, I'm sure that's available. But generally what happens is the rest of the team, and this is a team thing, the rest of the team kind of put your arm around that guy and say, look, don't worry about it, it's fine, mistakes happen. And that guy who may have made a mistake in a pit stop, the team tend to bring him to the centre of the fixing that problem, looking at the solution from it. If something's happened, the guy who was at the centre of it is perhaps the best placed person to know how we should address that for next time. So it's definitely not like you get cast out and you're sacked after making 1 pit stop error, which I think in the old days was definitely the feeling. It's much more about the team pulling around that guy, helping him through it, or her through it, and using his experience from that, or his or her experience, to be part of the solution moving forward. Now there was another question on pit stops, which came from Halion Gaming, who says, "Hi Mark, what do you think caused all the pit stop errors today? Seems strange that a lot of teams all had issues, whereas normally one, if any, teams normally have an issue. Anything specific about Mexico? I know a lot of personnel were ill." Well, that's true. There was a lot of illness going around, as there always is in Mexico, with people eating dodgy food or having dodgy tummy. But I don't think that was the issue. I think actually it was much more heat related, and I've seen this many times in the past when you go to some extreme races where the temperatures are extreme, and actually Mexico wasn't in necessarily extreme temperatures, but we were in an extreme situation where we weren't able to cool the parts of the car, so everything was getting really hot. And what happens is the wheel nuts, which are kind of most of them are aluminium, really lightweight aluminium, can perhaps swell up or expand further than they normally would, and then you start to get issues with binding or cross-threading, and it can be tiny amounts we're talking about, but that's all there is in a pit stop. That's what makes the difference. So I would imagine it's things like that. Wheels can get stuck on, or maybe don't, a cooler wheel, a cold wheel, or a relatively cold wheel, going onto a red hot hub. They build all these tolerances in, of course, but you know, when it's that hot, you can have issues, and so I suspect it was more related to that. It did seem like they were more than normal. I would say that's probably more to do with it than anything else. Plus there might have been one or two coincidences that just happened to fall on the same day as well. But in my experience, in those really extreme temperatures or heat situations, you can have problems. Okay, this is a good one from Hassie, who says, "Hi Mark, when Mercedes win the Drivers' Championship, which most probably will be in the next race, will it not be useful to introduce new power units with upgraded components in Brazil or Abu Dhabi to test for next season despite the grid penalties?" Yes, that absolutely. You know, if Mercedes have some upgraded components and production is at a stage where they are produced and tested on a dyno and are ready to go into a race engine, and that's a big if, because of course normally they wouldn't be targeting that, but if they've been able to accelerate production to that point, why not? If they wrap it up, if both of their drivers are safe in their positions, then why not introduce something as a test case for next year? Of course the regulations stay stable for next year, so it would make some sense, and I would not be surprised if they're able to do that. If they, as I say, if production is moved on advanced enough that they've got these parts in the system and are ready to go, which is another big if. But yeah, it kind of goes against the spirit of the regulations, of course, but I mean, look, if it will give them an advantage, then they will look to pursue that, I've no doubt. Right, this is a good one to finish on, from Stuart Pocklington, and perhaps this is a good one that I can open up to you guys as well. I'll give you my thoughts on it, but by all means fire in your own thoughts on this, it would be really useful. F1's in a really good place right now. 3 teams at the top, all running close to each other and fighting for wins. A slight tweak on the aero to aid overtaking, and then a period of stable regs will give everyone the F1 they want to see. What do you think? Well, I'd love to know what you think. I totally agree with you, Stuart. My only thing is that a tweak to the aero regs to enable overtaking is not just a tweak, it's a fairly substantial change. And that is what we're getting in 2021. We're getting a change to the aero regs to allow that, exactly. But then stable regulations is what brings the field close together. It was exactly the same at the end of the V8 era, when the engines all converged in terms of performance. We're finding it now, of course, with the power units after all this time. Everybody's becoming really quite close together, and we're seeing some great racing. We really are seeing great racing. This season for me has been absolutely brilliant, and I know lots of you disagree because the championship's going to be wrapped up early, and you know, we've only had 3 teams competing, and really only 2 teams competing, if we're really honest. So in that sense, you know, I'd love to see the field, the whole field, closer. But in terms of a spectacle on race day, it's been great. The thing for me is all about, the thing that needs to change in the background is the financial playing field needs to be levelled, because that's how we're going to start to close up the teams at the front and the teams at the back. That's the biggest differentiator. It always comes down to money. It's not the only answer, because it depends how you spend it, of course. But you can't compete with no money in Formula 1. And if we want to see a moment like we had in football a few years ago where Leicester City won the Premier League, you know, we're not going to see that in Formula 1 right now. So I think we should be aiming to be able to have something like that, and that means allowing the teams to have similar levels of resource, which all of course comes down to money. And then let's leave it, let it play out and see how things go. I would of course love to know what you think. So drop me a line, let me know. That's it for questions today. I'm going to hold it there because I think we've probably gone on long enough. And I've got to do one more thing before we go, which is pick the winner of that amazing piece of artwork by Kieran Roberts, and thankfully supplied by the GP Box. I've got all the entries that used the correct hashtag into the comment picker, and I'm going to pick a winner and let you know who it is in just a moment. Right, I am very pleased to say that the winner this week is Henry Howson. Henry Howson, congratulations. And you entered on Instagram, that one was. Henry says, Love the contrast between the colours of the cars and the grey track. Would look great on my wall. Really fantastic artwork. Well, Henry, it will look great on your wall, and it's coming your way. So congratulations, mate. Well done. Thank you to everybody who took part. Thank you very much to Kieran Roberts, who painted it. And if you want to check out more of Kieran Roberts' stuff, it's all available on the gpbox.com site. I'll link his page on that site in the description of this video, so if you'd like to check out more of his artwork, please go and do it, because it is great. So thank you to him, thank you to the GP Box for supplying it, of course, as well. There'll be another one of those coming for the American US Grand Prix next weekend, so not long to wait. If you didn't win, thank you very much. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will catch you very, very soon. In fact, on Thursday for the preview to the Austin race. Ta-da.